Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Welcome to our pandemic-induced virtual launch party for Magnolia Midcentury Memories, the third volume in our series of history books on the Magnolia neighborhood. I'm Tab Melton. I'll be your host for this evening. I want to thank you for joining us. We've got a great program ahead of you. As I said, this is the third volume of Magnolia history that we've done, and by far the best, I'm certain. And here are some Zoom notes on your screen. Thank you for being here. We're excited to share this new book with you. We're going to be recording this, so if you want to tell your friends about it so they can check it out on the website or Facebook, please do that. Mind your manners, of course, because you are on tape. You're all beautiful, but if you don't want to be seen in the recording, turn off your camera. And everybody's going to be muted except for the hosts and authors. Don't take it personally. And you can ask questions in the chat. They will go to the interviewers. You won't see them on the screen, so don't worry if you don't see your question right away. And like I said, please be patient. We're new to this, and we're doing our best. First of all, I would like to hand it over to Monica Wooton, who spearheaded this whole project from start to finish, did amazing work, and she wants to do some acknowledgments and thank yous. So take it away, Monica.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you. I hope that you will be patient with me. I have a lot of things to say after 2.5 years of working on this book. I want to welcome you all, and finally, with many midwives and parents, this book, written by and for Magnolians and beyond, is finally in the hands of the people we wrote it for. So I'm very excited to celebrate tonight. So I'm going to go through a little bit of history, since history is my thing. Over 60 people created this third chorus of voices that expose the heart of the Magnolia neighborhood through its histories of the 50s and 60s. The 50s was the male-dominated, family-centered, church-building era, the Leave It to Beaver baby boom years. Oh, and there was the beginning of rock and roll. And then we entered the 60s, a decade of social agendas and social changes. The era of civil rights began. The Vietnam War was up close and personal for the many young men who entered it and for those that dodged it. Most of us watched our first war on TV, sitting at TV trays, eating TV dinners. Blondes were still supposedly having more fun, but the beginning of feminism was about to enter the scene. Detroit burned in race riots, and San Francisco hosted that same year, the Summer of Love. Oh, and there was more rock and roll. That decade ended on Woodstock. The Cold War was hot. We ducked and covered in case a bomb dropped. Our mothers marched for dimes to defeat polio, and they did with Jonas Salk. Little kids, completely jazzed by penny candy, challenged the fluoride now newly added to toothpaste. Fun became a blast. We all knew where we were when JFK was shot. A new music scene from England emerged with the Fab Four. We had our Pacific Northwest sound. Hip kids were everywhere, in bowling alleys smoking cigarettes, posing as greasers at the local theater, and all outside without supervision until the streetlights came on. But I want you to know that these books are not just written for the Magnolia neighborhood. These books are about every neighborhood, the experiences every child shared in common, the changes of every decade that would change all of us. Magnolia is just the microcosm of every neighborhood, of every city, of every county, to each and every state in the United States of America. And that is the true measure of what has been done with the writing of our Magnolia books. If you wanted to write for the Magnolia book, you would have to agree to do a lot of things. get images that would work, be in a writing relationship with a peer editor, get edited by a professional editor, do academic research, interview, show your sources. You do not just get to sign up and write. You signed up to rewrite. Some of us had 13 drafts before we got something worth keeping. On the Lighthouse draft in book 2, my peer editor sent me back 27 times. I never asked anyone who worked on the books to do anything that I was not willing to do myself. It was with a tentative hope and a teeny little wish that Paul Langland, the brilliant designer of our 3 books, put the number 1 on the spine of our first book, Magnolia Memories and Milestones. 13 authors then birthed the Magnolia Historical Society that we know today. The U offered us a photo archive and a document one as well. We received a significant photo collection of Ken Baxter that has been a big part of making these books ever since. The Associated King County Heritage Organizations awarded that book the Marie Falkins Award. In 2007, Paul put the number 2 on the spine of Magnolia Making More Memories. In that time, 32 authors took up the challenge to write about Magnolia in the 20s and 40s. Significant research was done on the archaeological dig that proved to be to the world that ancestral Duwamish hunted and gathered at West Point Beach over 4,000 years ago. Barbara Wade Gates gave us her magnificent memoir as she wrote about being a valley girl, a Pleasant Valley girl, and revealed the behind-counter secrets of the fountain at Magnolia Pharmacy. I had always wanted to get to the 50s and 60s. When I grew up on Magnolia, I wanted to write about my Italian immigrant roots and how they got me to Magnolia. And that became especially important for me in the past couple of years. I wanted to write about living in a family of 12 who grew up Catholic on Magnolia. We had never written about that before. And I was shocked and pleased that there were 60 authors this time who wanted to make that journey with me. There are fun and important stories in this collection. The practice of redlining, systemic housing discrimination was alive and well in our neighborhood, the city of Seattle, and across the nation. We had the spotlight of the world on us with Century 21's World's Fair. Boys loved their cars, and teens across the nation loved their 19-cent burgers in the American graffiti scene we witnessed in Seattle at Dags and Dick's. Together, we all recalled what it was like to reside here in the 50s and 60s, really to reside across America during 2 very different, very dynamic decades that constantly changed us. I want to say thank you to the Magnolia Chamber, to the Magnolia Art Experience, to Casper's Catering, to Cameron Catering, to Dick's Drive-In and the Magnolia News, who helped us with all of our events and our publicity and covered us during this journey. I believe even more strongly now, as John P. Dillon said, all history is local, at least because our understanding of the world, past and present, begins with what we experience for ourselves. I want to thank all the writers who worked on this book for their very literary ways of writing, their earnest efforts to get it just right, and their strong sense of place exhibited with enthusiasm as they wrote and rewrote and rewrote. The professional staff, thank you. Paul Langland, Judy Goldthorpe, Tab Melton, Rebecca Pillsbury, Karen Sealander from the Department of Neighborhoods, D. St. George and the MHS Board, the leadership team, the researchers. I loved working with you, each and every one. You all rock and roll. Thanks once again for the Magnolia Memories.
Thanks, Monica. Now I'd like to introduce my co-host for the evening, Clay Eels, local author, historian, and journalist. Clay's now writing many of the Now and Then columns in the Seattle Times. I hope you saw his piece this morning about the Chase Bank, which in its glory years was the Magnolia Theater. Yeah, this book was a huge undertaking, 448 pages, 60 authors, more than 400 archival photos and illustrations. Tonight we're showcasing the work of 5 authors, but there's so much more to the book than we could actually put into 90 minutes or so. For example, I'm sure everyone knows that Discovery Park was once Fort Lawton, an active military post. We look into the various missions and roles that the fort had during its military career. And we've got some wonderful stories from military brats who grew up and went to school there and some of their fun times. And if you read the book, you know that I'm not using the term brat disparagingly. So then there's other, you're going to look at some mid-century modern architecture, particularly those wonderful Roman brick houses that we see all over the neighborhood. A lot of pictures of places that you'll still recognize. For example, here's Thrifty Drugs from the olden days, which you all recognize as Ace Hardware now. And that actually used to have a lunch counter in it where kids would go and have Cokes and fries after school, or in many cases instead of school. And there's a lot more. We've got big story about how we went from having little various makeshift stopgap libraries into the real beautiful library we have today. And we've got the garden clubs, we've got the scout troops, the sports leagues that really shaped the character of the neighborhood and the experiences that everybody had living and growing up here. Our first author tonight is Skip Cotkins. Skip, thanks for joining us all the way from the East Coast. Hope we're not keeping you up too late.
Nope, still on West Coast time.
Okay. No jet lag. Good.
Skip, tell us about Perkins Lane. You grew up there, and tell us what your inspiration was for deciding to write about Perkins Lane, a world apart from the rest of Magnolia.
Well, there were 2 inspirations. The first one is when Monica asks, you can't say no. So that was, I expect that the other authors were probably in the same boat with me on that. But, I like to think that if I knew then what I know now, I would have realized what a really special place it was to grow up on Perkins Lane. And the process of writing the chapter really helped me reflect back on how unique it was. And the kids that lived down there, the families that lived down there. I don't know if we've got a picture or not, but everybody knew about the slides. In fact, the slides were probably the thing that most people knew about Perkins Lane, because periodically a house would go down into the bay, and then in about the mid-1990s, the whole south end of the lane ended up down in Puget Sound. But despite the fact that the slides were probably the headline, it really wasn't what living on Perkins Lane was about. There was so much more to it, and it was really fun to think back. And I know some other members of the kids on the lane, Diane Spalding, some others contributed to the chapter as well.
Skip, can you tell us, for those who are not familiar, why Perkins Lane is so separate from the rest of the Magnolia Peninsula? And did the twain ever meet?
Well, the twain meet by 2 streets, West Ray Street and then Ruffner up at the north end. But other than that, unlike most city streets that have multiple intersections, there's 2 ways in and 2 ways out, and that's it. And so nobody drives through Perkins Lane on the way to anywhere. It is a destination. And for that reason, I think an awful lot of people may not have had any reason to go there. And certainly when you're driving down Magnolia Boulevard and you're looking at that magnificent vista of the Sound to the west, you have no idea that there's something down below.
So what made it different besides the slides? What really brought you all together when you grew up there?
Well, I think early in the chapter, I think I used the phrase, I grew up in the country. And compared to my friends from Briarcliff Grade School and up the hill, we had a very different existence. No sidewalks, You know, it was very different. And we lived on the beach. We lived in the hillside. We went barefoot all summer. It was a very different kind of existence from the rest of the city. And yet there we were 10, 12 minutes from downtown. And
you also were just a stone's throw away from the water. Tell about this unique rock that is a part of your story.
Well, 4 Mile Rock, which is in the picture, was so named because it's 4 miles from Yesler's Wharf at the foot of Henry Yesler's sawmill. And it marked the official entrance to Elliott Bay. And what you see on the picture on top of this giant boulder was a steel aid to navigation, according to the Coast Guard, and on top of it was a light, and that light flashed, and ships coming in and out of the bay would recognize and actually change course to head into Elliott Bay when they came abeam of 4 Mile Rock, if they could see it. If they couldn't see it, there was a foghorn. And the foghorn was something that any of us who lived on Perkins Lane never heard because it was so much part of the background that we didn't think about it. But if we ever had house guests, they would come down bleary-eyed in the morning and say, what was that noise that kept going? So yeah, and there's Indian lore that says that this boulder had some, I think, special powers or a special meaning to the Native Americans. Of course, it was a remnant of the receding glaciers that formed Puget Sound.
So when you wrote this chapter, what made it fun for you? What made it sing? What made it the kind of thing that you wanted to carry through to completion?
Well, look at that picture. You know, does that look like what most people had in their front yard growing up in Magnolia? You know, and the fun part was recognizing how really different it was. And thinking about my kids and my grandchildren, and what a very, very special opportunity it was for this pack of kids whose parents had chosen to live there, to live in the water, to live on the hillside. And it was really fun to go back and just think about that, Clay, and appreciate once again how unique it was.
Well, when you say you felt like you were in the country, you feel that way, but you're just minutes away from downtown.
In fact, it's a little known piece of information, but when they platted Seattle, there are actually 2 city streets platted on the tidelands, because at one point they thought, well, maybe they're going to build streets out there. So not only were we minutes from the city, if you looked at a map, we were actually on the grid. The only problem is the grid was wet, certainly the better part of most days.
So you could literally be underwater on your mortgage.
Yeah. Thanks, Tab.
It's a great story. You just have to read it to get so much more out of it.
Absolutely.
And Diane Spalding's chapter in the same section was really excellent too.
Yeah, I certainly want to encourage people not just to read it because I wrote it, but because I think all of the authors had the experience of reliving their youth and growing up and having a chance to tell today's readers about it. I encourage everybody, get the book and read it.
Well, you know, it's also an example of a neighborhood within a neighborhood. And I think anybody can identify with that. You know, when people ask you, where do you live? You know, you have a choice. You can say, well, I live in Seattle, or I live in Magnolia, or I live in Perkins Lane. You know, and they all have different shades of meanings to different people. And you've obviously got a pride of having lived through that very formative time for yourself in a unique part of Seattle. So thanks for doing the chapter.
Sure, it was my pleasure.
So our next one, we have Tab. Why don't you introduce Greg here? We've got 2 chapters by him. Tab is frozen out, so I guess I can do this. Greg, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh, and you've got video too, because we had a problem with that last time. The first chapter, you know, from when we practiced this, we decided to add a photograph about the overall tapestry theme that you really were inspired by, and that's the one of the moon over Magnolia School. And could you talk a little bit about this photo and how it relates to how you got into this chapter and writing it?
Certainly. Well, people probably heard of Tim Durkin, Jenny Durkin's brother. He's got tons of famous moon photos over the top of the Space Needle. So a lot of people have been kind of chasing the moon just because of Tim Durkin. And this was one of the things I was doing. But that night in the summer of 2018, they were actually working. It was almost 10 at night, and they were sawing through the brick with the diamond tip saw on Magnolia Elementary. And so all these thoughts were running through my mind as I was thinking about the book that I was trying to write, or my chapter for the book, and then watching the moon come up. And at that time I was actually reading Thomas Wolfe, and the way he can write paragraph long sentences, I think kind of had all these thoughts spinning together at one time. So I was just had these thoughts spinning around in my head about being there when I was in elementary school. That was called the lower playfield. When I went to Magnolia Elementary, I remember playing baseball down there and then kickball up above. But at that moment, the sounds coming from the school late at night was just almost sort of ghostly.
Huh.
And
Well, it certainly comes out in the photo, and the school is really a huge touchstone. Tell us about your best memories from this school that are reflected in your chapter.
well, I recall when they were doing all this construction work that a lot of the front stairs were jackhammered out. And I remember, I think you probably have a photo of one of the, maybe it's a kindergarten graduation class sitting on the front stairs. That's where they would take the photos.
Yes.
I remember Mrs. Galbraith, who was the math teacher in the 5th grade. She was talking about multiplying, dividing fractions, and she wanted to show, not tell what inverted meant. So she asked a student to stand up in front of the class, and she was, really good sized and strong, not overweight, but just strong. She lifted the boy up, rotating him 180 degrees, so he was upside down, and she said, "Now this is what inverted means." And I don't think anyone that was in that class ever forgot what inverted meant.
I don't think you could get away with that today.
Right. Who knows where she'd be in the principal's office. Another thing that I recall in the 5th grade was going over to a classmate's house during lunch hour. His parents were gone, and he said, "My dad's got some Playboy magazines. Do you want to see them?" So we snuck over there. We're not supposed to leave the school grounds, but went over there, and it was probably the first time some of us have ever seen a partially naked person. And that's just some of the things that I think happened at that age.
What grade were you in at the time?
That was the 5th grade.
Oh my, oh my, oh my.
So it was pretty exciting. One thing that just recently happened last summer was I got a call from an editor of a magazine that's not being published now, but he said there's a man that lives in Magnolia who's going to be turning 100 soon. He's a World War II veteran. Would you like to interview him and write an article? And I said, yes, I would. And it turned out it's Bob Chrisman's dad.
Oh.
And he had actually was on Tinian Island and helped load the atomic bombs onto the Enola Gay. But I did confess to him when I was over there interviewing him about the time we snuck over there. So when he reads the book, he won't be too shocked.
So here we have visual proof that you're growing up in Magnolia, and this bicycle has a story behind it as well.
All kids and bicycles is sort of a milestone. When they get a bicycle, they have a new freedom. I remember going down to Tommy's bicycle shop, which is now where Belltown is. It was like a former warehouse. The floors were like the old spaghetti factory, really thick planked floors with scars and patina, and just had their own story to tell. But it was dark and grungy inside. But once we got inside, there were all these rows of shiny new bikes and excitement. And so I picked out a bike, which was that one, and we loaded it into the 51 Pontiac station wagon. A Woody, or actually it wasn't really wood, it was painted metal wood on the side at that time. Took it home and learning how to ride. I had ridden someone's bike with training wheels and you just kind of rock from side to side. So I thought that was ridiculous and didn't want training wheels. So I would just, you know, ride as far as I could till I fell off. And I guess kind of a negative reinforcement. But, you know, that was a thrill and a little, I think I wrote in the book that about a year or two later, I had gotten a speedometer for it and it went up to 45 miles an hour. I took it over to the east side of Lawton Elementary School, which is a really steep hill that dead ends, to see how fast it would go. So I go all the way to the top and it levels out at the bottom with plenty of room to stop, or so I thought. And kept my eye on the speedometer and it pegged itself at 45 and I had about 300 feet before the intersection. That's where the midnight mart is. So I locked up the brakes and slid for about 300 feet until the back tire exploded. I stopped before the intersection. And then the story goes on that I got a new tire and tube for it and took it down to the Magnolia Village to one of the many, many gas stations. And they had a new type of air pump. Instead of just holding it on there, you kind of set the pressure and it got locked on and wouldn't come off and kept pumping air until the tire exploded again.
Wow.
And it was really loud and people, you know, almost throughout the village heard it. I was so upset the attendant at the gas station fixed it for free. But that's just the way, you know, things go in Magnolia.
It's the kind of thing where you know, these are disasters in the moment, but what great stories and memories afterward. Talk a little bit about the paper drive.
Well, the paper drives were every year for things that weren't in the school budget, like, you know, a new mimeograph machine. The mimeograph machines had this, when they were running this, I think it was methanol and some type of alcohol that just wafted out throughout the building. But that's what the money was used for, was things that weren't in the budget. But we would go out and each room would compete with the other rooms trying to see who could collect the most papers. And then we would bundle them up and take them to school. And what looks like windows was cyclone fencing, and that was an indoor play field for when it was raining, and the papers would be stored in there and stacked up and then hauled away with semi trucks.
This is early day recycling, and you can see from this photo, it was a big deal.
And it was all those things people enjoyed. It wasn't drudgery, or, you know, we enjoyed doing it. It was like a competition. I remember I really enjoyed Popular Science and Mechanic magazines, and I had new ones from the 50s and 60s, or these were the 50s then. But this one cache that I got in a house near where I live now had probably 100 Popular Science and Mechanics going back to as far as 1909. And that was, you know, a real treat. I still have some of those that didn't make it to the recycling. I thought someday they're going to be worth a fortune. I've looked on eBay and they're worth about $1.
Right.
Wow. Well, you know, we're going to transition here, Greg, to the other chapter that you have in the book. And this one is a little more poignant, and talk about going from formative time as a kid to leaping right into the war in Vietnam. And tell us about your inspiration for writing about this. Why did this become meaningful for you? Really personally, it was a challenge, I know, but it also was something that brought something out of you that you didn't even know you had.
I think maybe the catalyst for it was, I remember going into the building and I wrote in a diary that had started, the thick gray door closed and all noise was gone, and I knew my life would never be the same. About a year or two before the book came up, someone I knew was going down to, now I can't think of the name of the church that sponsors the homeless shelter, but now it's a homeless shelter. And we're getting close to that area, and I'm having this premonition that this might be the same building where I went into the Army. And so it was like all of a sudden I've gone full circle, 48 years later, and it was just, created something in me that kind of maybe got the gears spinning and thinking about it a little bit. And I had kept part of a diary, but most of it was illegible after all these years writing on both sides of the page. The ink ran through and you couldn't really read it, but I'd reread parts of it. And, once I started thinking about it, it was just a catharsis. Well, actually, the way it started, now I remember, was I took a photo, and you have that photo, and posted it on Facebook just because I thought this might be something people have never seen. And the way people responded really caught me off guard. They were thanking me and extremely grateful, and I had never experienced anything like that. And I almost, get emotional now just thinking about it. And so I wrote about that experience, and then that experience expanded into the, all the other parts of what I wrote about.
The earlier chapter about your childhood, and then this chapter, really, these two straddle the 2 decades that Monica was referencing. And boy, how did it change your life? I mean, it was a huge change for you, and just the process of writing about it was an experience in itself. This is one of the photos that you brought to the book from your own personal collection. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, that was after the ammunition dump. It was during the 1968 Tet Offensive, and I was in the 1st Cavalry Division, which was about 20,000 troops. In the area that it covered, it was in northern part of South Vietnam. It was almost the size of Magnolia, and it had a small airfield on it. But the ammunition dump was hit by a Vietnamese rocket. It was right around early evening, and it set off the whole ammunition dump. I wrote in the book, and I mentioned there was 3 gigantic explosions, and I think it was 3 million or 7 million pounds of explosives all cooking off at one time in these 3 separate explosions. But it wiped out all the people that were stationed close to the ammunition dump, and they were running through the night with the shrapnel just flying through the air. And we were in this bunker. There's what you can see, a small hole on the left. And that's where you entered it. It was made for like maybe 12 people, and we had probably 50 in there, just like sardines. It was very uncomfortable for about 8 hours, just all smashed together. But it was, the company commander was in there. He got a communication over the walkie-talkie that the base was being overrun, shoot to kill. And I was right near the entrance, and there were these, people from other companies who their bunkers were even destroyed, looking for shelter. And so, I'm screaming, "Don't shoot them." And so all these people poured into our bunker, and we just were in there for about 8 hours. And I think this was in the morning after everything was over, and we were eating some sea rations.
Tell us about your experience with the helicopters as well.
Well, it was a Chinook company, and the Chinooks were used to, haul troops, to haul supplies. They were used a lot to pick up downed aircraft. They would sling load them underneath, and the nickname was, they called them the Hook, because they just used a hook to sling load their loads. They used them on some real diabolical missions. One was 50-gallon drums that were just rolled out the back. We didn't, they said it was CS gas or tear gas. We don't know what it was. Another time there were these like polypropylene donuts with a serrated knife blade sticking up on each side. So no matter which way they landed, this barbed knife was sticking straight up. Yeah. And they dropped those throughout the jungle. One mission I went on was we would sling load 50-gallon drums of aviation fuel or diesel fuel underneath the helicopter and just hover over a suspected enemy location and then drop it, and it would detonate on contact. But it was an early morning and we were near the coast like you see in this photo,
Right.
but a bank of fog. And as we got down lower, we were in this fog and clouds. And I had mentioned in the book that I thought only weak-minded people, experienced vertigo. Well, I seriously couldn't tell if I was upside down or right side up. I couldn't, gravity didn't have any play anymore. If I was the pilot, it would have been a bad thing. But we were able to, the pilots were, didn't experience that and dropped that, and we were out of there. There was one mission that was, I think, the last thing that I wrote, and as I put the pieces together, and your memory is kind of vague from way back then, but I put all these pieces together, and I was scared on this mission because it was just horrible weather. But as I put all the pieces together, it was more terrifying. That by doing the math as far as the time in the air, we had to have been in Laos, which we weren't supposed to be. We picked up about 120 Vietnamese soldiers. The aircraft was made to carry 33 American soldiers with their combat gear. The Vietnamese were stacked like cordwood in the back. Jeez. And it was extremely turbulent. It was beyond weather that you would normally ever fly in. We were overloaded and it didn't even have the power to maintain a steady altitude, and we were just being thrown up and down sideways. These people were flying around. When, putting all the pieces together, I was scared during that time, but I thought nothing of it once we landed and got out of the aircraft, and just thought that was a little bit scary. But when I, at my age now, and think of put the pieces together, it was, almost a miracle that we made it, it seemed like. And I believe there probably could have been more aircraft to pick up the Vietnamese, but for some reason, maybe they didn't want to risk more than one aircraft, and the pilots weren't going to say we can only take, 33. They took everybody. But that was an experience that was one of the scarier ones. Another time we would go down to Da Nang. There was such a contrast in the war where we were living in tents and being rocketed all the time. Of course, as I will relate, at Da Nang we were rocketed again, but going down there, it was like a regular city. I ended up riding around on a bus throughout the city just to see what it looked like, with no weapon. I write about a Vietnamese woman holding a baby, and both her clothes and the baby's clothes were just ragged. And what a contradiction between the beauty of this woman and the baby, and then seeing razor wire behind her, and the dichotomy of the two just was a picture that I can never forget.
You're certainly exemplifying the fact that when you start writing about something, things become more concrete and they're not as foggy in your memory anymore.
Right.
And to wrap up this section, I know that there's an element of this that's important for you to tell, and that is reflected in the chapter, and that is, what was Magnolia like for you when you came back from Vietnam?
I rented a house on Perkins Lane for $75 a month. And the house later sold for $29,000, and it had a high bank, but it went all the way down to the water. Yeah. And I, moved in there shortly thereafter, and I started work at the spaghetti factory and worked as a waiter. And so we would go out and, party every night after work and use up our tip money, the $30 a night we would make in tips.
But Magnolia wasn't the same old Magnolia as when you were a little kid.
Right, my life was totally different. I was an only child. My parents were overprotected of me. There was the Navy pool down in Interbay. My parents wouldn't even let me go down there to swim because they didn't feel I was supervised well enough. Yeah. So here I am, in Vietnam and in the Army. Just, you couldn't have had a bigger change or somebody more naive. But I think that was true of a lot of people.
Well, it's a story that people can really relate to through your eyes.
I just wanted to mention one more thing about Da Nang. We would go down there and get beer and soda, and they would be stored in shipping containers when we got back to where we were at. But we normally wouldn't stay overnight, but this night we stayed overnight. We were hit by rockets or mortars, and normally would run into the bunker. We go running. All these people were in a barracks that they weren't used to. We go running outside in what appeared to be a bunker. We went in, but it hadn't been finished. There was no PSP metal plating over the top and sandbags, so it was just like an open hole. And all these rockets are being walked in, and you hear the shrapnel hitting the buildings. And it was just, a terrifying experience, not knowing if you were going to live or die and that you couldn't do anything about it. Normally, when you were in the bunkers, if you were going to be hit by a rocket, you wouldn't know about it. Couldn't see anything. But this time, we could see and hear everything. Well, it was a contrast because I'm looking up at the black sky and the stars, and I remember before I left for Vietnam being with this girl, and we were out walking at night and looking up at the stars, and here the contrast is so great that it couldn't be more different.
It's another example of a vivid story that people can relate to. And thanks very much for relating both of those. We're going to move along to the next chapter. Tab's frozen out visually, but Tab, go ahead and introduce Mike.
Well, our next guest is Mike Musselwhite, who served as the assistant manager of the Magnolia Theater in its glory years. Of course, you saw the old time picture of the theater in Clay's column this morning.
Well, that was kind of a fun photo to spotlight because it certainly had the context of a house being moved in front of it. But there probably couldn't have been a better marquee to feature with Elvis in It Happened at the World's Fair. So, Mike.
Let's get to the feature presentation.
That's right.
The short subject.
and Mike, we've got the opening advertisement for the Magnolia Theater back in 1948, I believe. Cary Grant starring in Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House. Of course, you didn't start there that early, but tell us about the Magnolian Theater and why you thought that this was a good thing for you to be writing about. I think you had a view of the Magnolia Theater that most other people did not.
Well, that's true. It's a big, big positive for just about anybody living in Magnolia. And frankly, Ballard and other areas. We have people coming to the theater from actually all over the city, but primarily from Magnolia. It's just a great place to go. You could meet friends there. You could, if you needed to just find some time to yourself, you could do that sitting in the dark of the theater and watching a movie. And as I had written somewhere in my narrative, it was just a great place to mend a broken heart if you needed a little time.
What a great phrase to turn. But for those who are not familiar, because there are a lot of people not familiar today because the place is gone, how big was it? And describe some of the splendor of it. I mean, this is not just what people are used to today with 4 walls of a multiplex.
It wasn't. It had a lot of really native materials. It had beautiful mahogany, woodwork inside the lobby, throughout the lobby. There's a great picture of it right there. And I'm so glad I haven't seen that view since I left working there.
Well, what was your role at the theater? Hey, you had several roles. Take us through.
I wore many hats. I really did. And I started off as a very young lad, once a week putting up the marquee. And of course, the marquee had 2 sides, so it took some time. And you had to arrange the lettering in such a way as that, as it turned out in this picture here, even and balanced and such. And you actually did that by putting all the lettering out for the upcoming movie on the ground. And you set it all up on the ground, and then you just climbed the ladder, and you went up there, and it was fairly high, believe me.
You weren't always coming back down safely.
No.
Tell us about the incident where you had a tumble.
I did. I was up at the height of the ladder, and I was standing literally on the top of the ladder, and holding on to the marquee. My hands were literally up about where the R is in Richard in the photo that you've got.
Okay, okay.
And it was a windy, kind of a wet evening, and it just blew me off the ladder. And
Oh my.
I fell off that ladder and landed right on my backside.
Oh,
And to this very day, I'm reminded regularly of that fall because, yeah, I suffered some injury there. I really did.
but somehow you weren't scared away from taking on other roles at the theater. I
No,
mean,
no, I wasn't. I was just in the right place at the right time, to be honest with you. And after I worked for a couple of years doing the marquee, then I worked myself up to the relief custodian. And the custodian, of course, was deserving of a couple of nights off. And so then I would fill in. And my job, of course, was like his job. And that was to sweep out the entire theater, clean the glass, and do all of the maintenance type things that custodial staff would do. And then, so that went on for a while. Now, I didn't give up the marquee. I liked that job. I enjoyed that job.
Yeah.
I can't tell you why, but I did. Anyway, so I became just kind of a fella that wore a green sports jacket provided by the theater that matched the beautiful dark greens in the carpet in the theater. And my task was to walk people to a seat that was available to them after the movie had started, because it was quite dark in there. And so I would take a flashlight in my hand and point it down towards the floor, and then people would follow me, and I would eventually get them to an open seat. So then after that,
you were an usher.
I was an usher. That's the word I was looking for. I was an usher. You're exactly right.
And a uniformed usher to boot.
Yeah.
And yes, I was quite sporty looking, I think, in the day.
What were some of the things that you saw with your flashlight? Or maybe you can't tell us.
Well, there are many stories that could be told. And as I explained to Monica that I really wanted to put the positive twist on it.
Mm-hmm.
And, there were a lot of stories that could have been told. I mean, a lot of people went through that theater with a lot of different motivations.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't just people coming to watch a movie necessarily.
Uh-huh.
But, yeah,
that's a very diplomatic way of putting it. Tab's got a question
Now,
here.
the boss had a very innovative way of marketing popcorn. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Well, yes. In the manager's office, there were 4 dials, and each dial connected and turned on a large fan, and they were used for 2 purposes. And the first purpose, as they were built for, was to bring fresh air into the theater. But it didn't take very long for someone to figure out that you could also begin to pop popcorn in the lobby, and it would pull the smell of the fresh popcorn right into the auditorium. And so about 15 to 20 minutes before, and remember in those days there were 2 movies and an intermission between the 2. So about 15 to 20 minutes prior to the intermission, the staff behind the counters would pop fresh popcorn. And of course, my job was to turn the fan on, the fans. And I can assure you, they did their job. They brought fresh air in, but they brought a lovely smell of popcorn as well.
Those
And we
people
just sold a ton of it, I'll tell you.
they were defenseless.
Yes, at our mercy, I would say, yes.
So before we go, it's probably important to note the high point of the Magnolia Theater's run. I know that you worked in several theaters, but the Magnolia had a distinction in 1969 as being the only place in Seattle where you could see the best picture of the year, Oliver.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And that just puts just a nice fine point on the Magnolia Theater. There were people who thought that was really a deserving theater to be the launch of Oliver for Seattle, and it was just great.
And then it went a little downhill from there. It wasn't long after that the theater closed. What a heartbreak
I think so. I think it was a collective heartbreak for most everybody living in Magnolia. And frankly, in all honesty and sincerity, I really believe that Magnolia really hasn't recovered from that loss. You know, that's something that was so unique to this community, and that there's nothing within this community that brings the same excitement and just the overall great atmosphere that that theater provided for the community.
It's something of its time, 985 seats.
Yeah, and believe me, I worked in that theater to see those 985 seats filled several times.
There were nights when you had to sweep out from under every 978 too.
It was a task, let me tell you. Yeah, but I got pretty good at not necessarily sweeping it all out. There were ways of kind of moving the spilled popcorn around a little bit. So
now, Mike, had you ever thought, I mean, this is decades ago that you're writing about, had you ever thought of putting into words your experiences? I mean, talk a little bit about how fulfilling it is to write about this now and to share it with other people.
Well, it's really fulfilling. When I was asked to be a writer for this, I thought, wow, where do I start, you know? But it actually began to become pretty easy because there were certain highlights of working in that theater that I could simply write about. And essentially, if you read what I've written, you'll take note that it's a series of stories within one big story. And it was just a lot of fun. And what it essentially has done for me is I knew a lot of people that worked at that theater over the years. And I began tracking some of them down, just trying to, as a hobby, just trying to find them, you know. And I've actually managed to find a few people, and it's been just great fun, just great.
It's a select group. Tab,
Yeah.
to wrap this up.
Well, the Magnolia Theater was certainly the hub of activity back in the day, 50s and 60s. Today we've got the Magnolia Community Center right there with Blaine K8, once Blaine Junior High School, where my dad taught about close to 70 years ago. And it may be hard to believe today, but 70 years ago, it was a radical idea to put two facilities like that right next to one another, almost tore the neighborhood apart.
So we're going to move on to the next chapter. Thank you very much, Mike. Whitney, are you with us?
I'm here.
All right. Good to see you.
Thank you.
This is a really great example in this book of I mean, people don't realize this is a book, almost 450 pages. I mean, this is a significant tome. And one of the most significant chapters is this very detailed account of what today people probably have no idea it was a community controversy. So Whitney, can you take us through this topic? The story is so vivid in its detail, and tell us about the approach that you brought to the topic of Blaine School and Community Center.
Well, I asked Monica to participate, and this was one of the topics that did not yet have a writer. And because I went to Blaine Junior High for 8th and 9th grade, I thought, well, it just makes sense for me to research and write this story. And I just kind of thought it would be about the architecture and about maybe students and teachers that attended and taught there. And I was sharing with a colleague, longtime Magnolia resident, Carol Batchelder, that I was getting ready to start researching and writing this story. And she said, well, I remember when Ione Peterson's house was moved so the school could be built. And I had no idea that there were homes there where the school and the field now exist. I had no idea that houses were condemned. This idea of a house being picked up and moved to a different location in Magnolia was fascinating to me. And I thought, well, I think I have my lead. And I also think I know what I really want to research. And so that was really kind of just a serendipitous door opening. And I promoted the project in a magazine that I send to clients, neighbors, and friends. And one of those who received that magazine, Dave Zatelli, called the Call Monica number and said, hey, are you doing anything on the condemnation? And Monica said, well, yes, Whitney's writing the story about Blaine. And Dave said, well, you know, we're in one of those houses that was condemned and moved, and Whitney's mother helped us buy it. And so when they moved into that house, there was a big box of papers sitting on top of the recycling bin, and it all related to the Barter's home being moved. I mean, it was an absolute treasure trove.
I'm glad
they
it wasn't in the recycling bin itself. My goodness.
Well, it was almost there, but Dave had the foresight to save it and had the interest in it. And so those pieces from the Barter's family's move were a really kind of almost an intimate view of one family's personal experience. I mean, even on the back of an envelope, it was, you know, I made you a ham sandwich, you can get your own coffee. I mean, it was just, it really transported you back to that time. And I think just realizing that it really was controversial, this concept of combining these two entities. And it was because it was new, and it was because the community had other ideas that had been evolving over several years. And so researching that by reading, you know, park board meeting minutes, school board meeting minute, Magnolia Community Club meeting minutes. And I would suggest that sometimes those meeting minutes might be a little on the sterile side, but you got a sense of what was really happening. I will say that the media back then still got things wrong and still had its own opinions. But that was a fascinating aspect as well. And then I would just say, learning where the other locations where they were talking about putting the school when it was still going to be separate from the community center was really fascinating to me, because it would have completely changed the landscape of Magnolia had the two buildings been separate and had they been put in the locations that were originally identified.
You know, the Seattle Times at one point said that this was the biggest community controversy in Seattle that had been seen for many years. And can you drill into it just a little bit more about what made this so controversial? I mean, the project itself, as it turned out to be, was quite unique. And yet, what was the controversy? Is it just to move, how many, 20 houses or so, to uproot them and to put this new concept into place? Can you drill into that a little bit more? Why were people so worked up about it?
Well, I think it went way back into the mid-30s when the community was really focused on increasing play space for kids, ball fields, a football field, et cetera. And over time, this idea of this amazing rec center, they referred to it as a Class A field house back then. And I never could find the actual definition of what a Class A field house was, but it was referred to a field house, a civic center. Over the years, this sense of what it was going to just be this amazing community center, you know, with the library, with the school, with the, you know, anyway. And over time, that had just grown really big. And so that was on its own track. And so you then separately had, you know, evolving in the country as a whole, the acknowledgement that junior high schools should be built to separately school 7th, 8th, and 9th graders. And so you have kind of these parallel tracks that were occurring, and they converged at the same time that the Planning Commission said, you know, it is practical to combine buildings where we can, when and where we can. And so those three, you know, I guess concepts, events, they all just converged, and they happened to converge in Magnolia. And so it was actually fairly complicated. It went back several years. And the condemnation was a factor, and it was personal and it was emotional, but you know, and certainly for the people who weren't in support of combining it, it was, you know, oh, you can't do this. But I think ultimately what happened was the city seemed to be very fair in how it was going to compensate these owners. And I think like the Barter family, who ended up realizing, you know, we're actually going to get something out of this. We're going to make some money. We can keep our house. We can move to a lot that has a view, and we can actually build an addition and make our house bigger. And so what initially might have been considered a negative or was used as a negative, really, I think in the long run worked out for those families. families. And what was interesting is the concept of them being condemned and destroyed. While I ran out of time to research every single house, it seems like all of those houses were moved. And that was much more common back then than it would be today for us to see a house rolling down the street.
And then there's also the idea of the city and the school district working together to put something together uniquely. That had not been done before.
No, and it was fascinating to read the meeting minutes from these two entities. And, the senior officials were very engaged. The mayor was engaged, and they really made the effort to interact with the community and get community feedback. But they also kind of had a sense of what they could afford. And amazingly, we have the benefit of hindsight, but they had the foresight to realize that this was really going to be economically important, but also just, I think of growing up in Magnolia, going to, school there. It's a pretty amazing concept that in today, it makes total sense.
Before we leave this topic, talk a little bit about the name. Where'd the name come from?
So in the school board meeting minutes, as I recall, the school board president basically said, it may have been the superintendent. I'd have to go back and read my own story. But somehow at that level, it was decided, let's get some names of different, Northwest historic figures, do some research. The school staff did that, brought it back to the school board, and they basically just voted. And Catherine Blaine was one of the top award winners. And how it specifically got assigned to Magnolia, I'm not exactly sure. It might have been sequential in terms of what was going to be built first and second, but that's how we ended up with Catherine Blaine, spelled with an E for many years, and then finally corrected and spelled with an A.
Just from reading the chapter, I just have such respect for what you did journalistically to take all of this massive data and synthesize it in a way that is understandable and pulls you through the story so well. And I'm just curious, after getting this all done, bringing it to fruition, and you look back, what was the most satisfying part of writing this chapter of the book for you?
Picking it up today and seeing it in hard copy.
That is nice when that happens. There's a glow that happens when you see it in print. It becomes real then.
Yeah.
And it's really a story of part of the heart of Magnolia. It's terrific. It's terrific. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Here we have a view of what it looks like afterward. We saw the view beforehand. We all can see here how proximate it is to the village and how it's just so central to the core of Magnolia. What an important story to tell. And we're going to move on to Brian Hogan. Brian, are you there?
I'm unmuted.
There you are. All right.
Brian, you cover some of the coolest things to happen in the 60s with a distinctive Magnolia spin to them, namely the Century 21 exposition and the British rock and roll invasion. So thanks for joining us. And
thank you. I got to do a kid's eye view of the fun stuff for Seattle in the 60s.
And
so,
you were there with that kid's eye view yourself. You lived this.
I was there, and I try to bring some of that fun to the two chapters I got to write.
Well, I want to ask you just right off the bat, can you even imagine today if the World's Fair were in Fort Lawton?
I actually tried to for the book.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about that in their planning. They were considering extending Alaska Way all the way around to Fort Lawton.
Wow.
And they would have taken out, or Skip Cotkins and his 4 Mile Rock would have been history if they had.
Now,
not Skip wouldn't have been, but his 4 Mile Rock.
Right around 4 Mile Rock.
People might have driven by, and said, "Oh, look down at that," kind of thing.
It would have changed Magnolia significantly back in.
Oh, absolutely, it would have probably wrecked Magnolia.
Yeah, and I'm sure in some ways.
Yeah.
Now, kids were involved in inviting people to the fair, Magnolia kids, and we've got this photo
Right.
from the newspaper. Talk about
a class
that.
from Bridal Cliff. Writing, just like school kids all across Seattle, they were asked to write letters about a year before the fair began to invite relatives, family, friends, to come to Seattle to maybe stay with them, but definitely come to Seattle and see this wild thing that was going on in this corner of the country.
Now, you just said this wild thing that was going on. Some people today may not really understand how the World's Fair just transformed Seattle, and it gripped us all back then. When we were kids, we knew the World's Fair was a big deal, perhaps the biggest deal we'd ever seen.
Yeah, and they did it with they had great marketing, and they certainly the structures, they backed it up. It was wildly different. You go from, we had, okay, there we got Elvis.
Well, I'm going to skip forward because
yeah,
this is a visual manifestation of what you're talking about right now.
So when I was a kid, we had in Seattle, all we had for a big structure was the Smith Tower.
Right.
Okay, and then you look and you watch this amazing structure going up in under a year. It goes boom. They built it fast. And to see this thing going up, you can see right from the top of that torch is the top of Magnolia Bridge. And that's where we would go. As you drove down that bridge, you could watch the Space Needle grow just in real time almost. It went up fast. This picture, it was started like in May of 61. They started the pour. Yeah. And this is probably January of 62. It's already practically done. They're finishing up here.
It's just like night and day difference between before the fair and after the fair.
And you see those bizarro buildings, that Coliseum down below
right.
that we used to see. We'd go up on Queen Anne Hill and look down and watch that thing, because there was a big fence around the whole building structure.
And of course, at that time, kids from Magnolia who were high school age went to Queen Anne High School, which yep. looks down on that whole site, and yep. Got to see it just take shape. And it wasn't just the buildings, as this previous slide indicates. It was who came to the fair, and you cover this in the chapter as well.
Oh yeah, and it wasn't just, I mean, we had everybody coming to the fair.
That's right.
I mean, Seattle was on the map as being the place that any touring company that came to New York City also included Seattle in 1962. So we got everybody coming. They would hit New York, they would hit Philadelphia, and they would hit Seattle. That hadn't happened before, and it was amazing.
And of course, Elvis came because he was making a movie that came out the year later that played the Magnolia Theater. So you've got an Elvis story in your chapter.
I do, and you put that in the it's in the featured article where one young lady went out to she cornered Elvis right out of his hotel room, and her goal, her mission was to get Elvis to give an autograph to both for herself, and she was going to get one for her sister.
She wanted two autographs. Yeah,
two autographs. She asked for two. Would you sign it twice, please? So Elvis obliged, but he flipped the paper over and wrote it right in the middle on both sides. And so she was faced with a real problem as far as who gets that autograph, me or my sister.
They didn't have computer scanners back then.
Yeah.
Tell us about your cousin's plan to foil the pickpockets when he came in from out of town.
Okay, yeah, my older cousin Mark, he lived in Port Townsend, and one of those letters that was written, my cousin showed up at our house to go to the fair, and he had heard that there were lots of pickpockets, and so he had written a special letter to pickpockets and stuffed that into an old wallet, and then attempted to get his pocket picked at the fair the day we went, unsuccessfully. But and was very upset that day we just couldn't attract any pickpockets.
You know, we're looking at a slide here about the World's Fair trade dollars, and you know, while I was reading the book, I realized that over on my desk, I was keeping a few of these actual trade dollars. And so I have them with me, this golden kind of a coin that was worth $1. But
you helped fund the fair.
That's right.
You helped by keeping that trade dollar of those 2 or 3, you and your family just paid the Exposition 21, the Century 21 Exposition made $3 off of you. And that was the coin. That was the coin of the realm in the state,
right.
and especially in Seattle during 1962. They minted them. The legislature passed a law that said that this was legal tender in the state of Washington, anywhere in the state, as long as the merchants agreed to accept it. They would put signs in their windows and say, yes, we accept trade dollars, because they knew at the end, if they were stuck with any of those, if they couldn't give them back to people in exchange, they could turn them in at the end of in 1962 and get $1 back. Well, and they were minted. Millions of them were minted, and they were used in stores. The store would help fund by giving real legal money to the fair promoters, and then they would accept these dollars and then desperately try to give them off to all the tourists and all the people, as change for any transaction that they had. And they were quite successful. I put in the book that, and there were lots of different ways to make money or spend money for the fair, but the fair made for Seattle made about $500,000. They ended in the black, which World's Fairs normally don't do. Although lots of people benefit from bringing in all the people coming. But our fair made about $500,000, and they actually made about $500,000 on trade dollars.
Well, they make a great souvenir, and you're talking about all of the entertainers who came to town, and this is about the same time that we're entering into the topic of your other chapter, which is the music at the time. And your chapter is called The British Invasion of Magnolia. Now, there's something that's quite provocative. So how does this title relate to Magnolia? Did the British actually physically come here? Go ahead, Tab.
I said the British did invade, but Paul Revere and the Raiders fought them off.
Well, that's part of it. So they came to us in a bunch of different ways, but it was through the air. Yeah. Right. It's through the radio stations, and KJR in 1964 had a monopoly on the airwaves, and they played because the other big radio station had dropped out right after the World's Fair, KOL for AM for the teen audience, and they didn't come back until 1965. So for a year, Pat O'Day and Associates and KJR, they had a monopoly on the Beatles and the Kinks and the Animals and all the bands that were coming over through the air and through the TV, and eventually through the movies, through actual physical appearances at the Seattle Center Coliseum that we saw being built. So that's where I started this. And then the reaction to it, I've got here is Paul Revere and the Raiders was part of the reaction. That's a Northwest band. Sure. But I focus on a little Magnolia band that kind of got big for a year, Tom Thumb and the Casuals.
We're going to see them right here. And
there they are. Tom Blessing was in this picture. The other boys from Magnolia are Scott Letterman and Jim Wolf, but Tom Blessing on the left, he is, although he looks older, he is 16 years old. He's the leader of this band at 16. He is just a sophomore in high school at Queen Anne at the time of this. And I kind of follow the rise and demise of this band. It lasted about a year. And
But during
Tom
that time, they made a lot of music, but they might be called a one-hit wonder, right?
Well, they had a couple, at this time they were the Seafair Bolo recording artists. You're right, they had like two, not really hits. They had, although they were promoted by KJR, they were one of those bubbling under bands. Never went.
Would you like to hear just a snippet of their biggest hit? Here we go.
Anybody that listens to that, if you're in the know, you can say that was a Northwest sound.
What made it a Northwest sound when you say that?
Well, it's funny. It was a heavy bass line. A lot of them, by this time, that song didn't start off with sax, and you didn't start it off right at the beginning, but Scott Letterman's drum entry into that really sets it off. They sound like the Sonics. They sound like, you just hear that opening. Starts off with Jim Wolfe playing a little organ, and then Scott Letterman just hits with a blistering drum that you go, wow, that's Northwest. and then of course Tom comes in with the singing, and you just know people that collect it or know it, that they say they are right in there with that.
It was, as you say, a very short-lived band, and there's some tragedy involved here.
Well, sure. It's got the whole arc. About a year into it, and they were looking. They had replaced the gentleman in the middle. He was the lead guitarist. They had gone through. They had a knack for going through not drummers, but they went through lead guitarists. They had their third lead guitarist within a year. But by that time, KOL, or actually Jerry, I think Jerry Denon of Jerden Records and in the KJR circuit, they found them a lead guitarist that had links to Paul Revere and the Raiders. Steve Valley was the lead guitarist that they had at the end. So they were on the cusp of going somewhere. And unfortunately, there was a car accident in Eastern Washington where Tom and Larry Evans, the bass player on the right, were both killed. And that ended Tom and the Casuals right there. So
wow. All the photos that we're showing, these are just a few samples of the more than 450 photos that are in the book.
These are bumper stickers that were given to me by the Red Hamilton Walker the first of KOL. When KOL jumped back in, and that's part of the story I tell too, is that the rivalry between those two big stations, KOL was not a minor player between 65 and 66. They were right in there.
Yeah.
And these are bumper stickers that if you'd like to put one on your car today, you could. So.
And the Tom Thumb Band wasn't the only one with Magnolia roots. Here we have the Noblemen.
These are the Noblemen. I think this was also referred to as Tom German's band, but Cliff Pecknold was Tom Blessing's best friend. He's the lead guitarist. It's right next to the sax player, which again also helped define the Northwest sound. Was a lot of saxophone was involved.
Mm-hmm. And I believe, you know, again, people need to realize that this is first person on your part. You were there. You experienced a lot of this in your youth. And
oh yeah.
So I'm not saying you are, but if you were to be in this photo, where would you be?
Well, I would be that little kid on the right, that little head right there, just watching the band, but not dancing with anybody because he's afraid of that.
Talk about what was so enjoyable and satisfying about writing this chapter of the book.
Oh, there's so many things. Well, you know what? The one thing, it gave me cachet to actually go back and try to find members of Tom Thumb and the Casuals, and I actually was able to hunt two of those guys down, and I got great interviews and great just talking to them about the joy of Northwest music with Scott Letterman and Jim Wolfe. I really had fun. This allowed me to do that where normally those people would probably say, well, go away.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what a great bit of research you did, as well as just your own memoir itself. I mean, it really is a chapter in this book that really sings. Everybody will enjoy it. And
Okay,
thank you so much. It's been great. Tab, you got anything more?
Brian, I mean, just the way you captured the whole ambiance, the atmosphere of the British invasion, with kids having their own favorite groups, and these are my groups, these are somebody else's groups. The rivalry between KJR and KOL that went down as far as the kids. It was just an amazing job. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tab.
Okay, well, thanks, Brian. Now it's time to hand the mic back to Monica Wooton for a special announcement.
I'm here to present a special presentation that the Magnolia Historical Society Board confers on a person who has done an outstanding job in preserving Magnolia history. And it's though it's not given every year. It's a special presentation only in the years when we feel someone has earned it. And so this year, I'm happy to announce that my friend and one person you all know and have worked with, Dee St. George, has been awarded this award. And there's a picture of Dee. I don't know if Dee's on right now or not, but I did want to say a couple things about her. And most of us tell time the same. BC, before Christ, BCE, before Christ era, and AD, which is to me some Latinate that has some designation different than what it means to me. Because to me it means after D. AD was that time in my life when it got easier and more fun and way more organized. D was there to consult on anything, anytime, night and day, and we often talked on the phone long after most of you have gone to bed, and sent email at dawn and had our families wait dinner because we had to figure something out. She is always, always kind, thoughtful, and full of philosophy. And these last months, it has been one day at a time, which is such good advice. And actually, every day is one day at a time. She's funny. She has a fun surprise up her sleeve during our marathon sessions to solve an MHS or book problem. She brings special treats, something fun from my office, or a thoughtful present from my daughter, Emily. That is Dee. She always lets you know you are doing a good job with a personal thank you and in a special way. She has been with MHS since book 2 was a twinkle in my eye. So we've worked together almost 15 years. She took on grant management at that time, and the partnership between us has been precious over those years. She served as treasurer, newsletter chair. She worked on the MHS John Legler sculpture for the village, and she now serves as president, treasurer, and the grant bookkeeper for this third Magnolia book. She works tirelessly behind the scenes, and now as president, sometimes she pokes her head above ground more often, and she makes friends with whomever she interacts. She is a huge part of making Magnolia Historical Society work and an invaluable part of making Magnolia Memories. Our partnership has been a comfortable marriage filled with respect, constructive compromise, and a rare sisterhood. We can read each other's minds, and often I call when she is just picking up the phone, or our identical email crosses at the same time. Magnolia and Magnolia's history has benefited, has survived, and flourished because of Dee's generous and most effective volunteerism. It has been my pleasure to have her working side by side. I personally thank her for that. But tonight, the Magnolia Historical Society Board thanks her for the many contributions on behalf of making Magnolia Memories as the 2020 Magnolia Historical Person of the Year. So tomorrow, Dee, you will receive a big bouquet of flowers, a gift card of appreciation, and your certificate, which I made for you. I did it both in silver and gold, so you can have your choice. But this is a D job. This is not a Monica job. So I learned from D. You will receive your certificate. Your name will be engraved on the plaque at the Magnolia Library, and everyone will know that you, D. St. George, made a big difference with your volunteerism. You are the greatest example of what volunteerism can be. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for all you have done. I'm thinking we have 10 more years in us, but are we retiring tonight? So congratulations to Dee, and without her, a lot of this could not have been possible.
So thank you, Monica. Tab, this has gone so well and it's gone so quickly.
It really has, but that pretty much wraps it up. I want to thank our authors that joined us tonight, Skip, Greg, Mike, Whitney, and Brian, for sharing their stories, and to everybody out in the audience for sharing your Sunday night with us. Clay, I can't thank you enough, and I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, it's been an honor to be here. This book is an example of how a local heritage organization can really involve its community and tell its story and have an impact that goes on and on and on. This is a launch, but this isn't just limited to tonight. This book will live on forever. And it's really something that's part of the legacy of the Historical Society. I do this now and then column with Gene Sherrard for the Seattle Times. And we're carrying on a tradition ourselves that Paul Dorpat established for 37 years. And we're just honored to carry on his legacy. And to be able to write about this book in the paper that came out this morning is just an example of how so many things come from the grassroots. And we're always looking for ideas for now and then and ways to promote heritage-related events in the community. So if any of you out there thinks you've got a good now and then, please contact us through pauldorpat.com. And Tab, it's been just terrific to do this with you. Tab and I go back a long ways, several decades. And so we're just grateful for that friendship. What a great way to celebrate a book, to involve so many people tonight. Thank you all for tuning in. And don't forget that you can get the book at that very website, and you also can get it at two places in person, at the Magnolia's Bookstore and at Interbay QFC. You may even, if you stop in at the QFC, see Tab back in the produce section.
Yeah, but I'll be wearing a mask, so you won't know me.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in.
I'd like to propose a toast to everyone who made this possible. Thank you. I drink to you.
Okay, here we have a toast to everybody who participated in this project tonight. Thanks to everyone. And good night.